Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the Beit Midrash, already in progress. It sounds like, as I was running a few minutes late. Glad to have you all here. Glad to jump in and learn together with everyone this afternoon. Beautiful Thursday afternoon.
Mhm.
So it sounds like there was a conversation that was going on when I signed on. Is it something that we wanted to discuss, or were you just schmoozing before we talk about Rabbi Sacks?
No, we were just schmoozing, but I think we were a little scattered and maybe need a little focus, or maybe somebody else will disagree with me.
Rabbi, do you need a minute to kind of decompress?
No, I'm good. I'm ready to dive in. So, we do have Rabbi Sacks, his commentary on Parashat Ekev, our Torah reading this week. Thoughts, comments, feelings, reactions, ponderings, ruminations, considerations. I'm running out of synonyms, at least.
So Eddie, I just want to say thank you for reading through the whole Parsha and sharing with us the detail on the punishments that Sacks doesn't focus on. And I find it interesting to focus on the word listening, because I think it's a challenge for all of us. We're all so busy with our own thoughts. It's really hard to stop thinking and open your mind sometimes to what someone else is trying to tell you, because frequently I find what they're saying is not necessarily the words they're saying, but the meat of it often is the thought behind those words. So I think that listening. And as parents, how many times have you said, listen to me, and you feel unheard, and the kids also feel unheard. So yay to the persons who can really listen, and we should all learn from them.
I always I was thinking of the meme that I see periodically come around, where the husband says, "My wife's always complaining that I don't listen to her," or something like that. I don't know. Yeah. Really listening and really paying attention is really hard. Because mentally we just want to say, we're already formulating our responses. We already know what we want to say. We know what we want to hear. And we're so busy mentally doing that we don't actually pay attention to what the other person is saying.
And always trying to make our own point.
Yes. And as I like to say, if it was easy, we'd all be doing it, and the rabbis wouldn't have had to tell it to us. If it was an easy thing, then nobody would have to teach it, because we'd be doing it already. So that's part of why that's there, right? Is to teach us of what we're supposed to strive for, what we're supposed to be trying to do, and who we're trying to be as people, and what God is actually asking of us to do, at least in this interpretation of what it means to truly listen.
I'm fine with it. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I don't know if of you watched television till after midnight again last night, but there was a great deal of discussion about how we need to listen to each other instead of just retiring to our privacy, our silo, whatever you call the kind of separation this particular era seems to be prone to suffer. It was amazing how many times it was noted. you can't just talk about yourself and what you think, what you hope they will do. You must stop and listen to them.
Yeah, I've said it before. Like, imagine what Congress would look like if they actually stopped and listened to each other instead of just hitting their talking points over each other.
Exactly. I find it very, very difficult in this circumstance to do this with politically opposite people more than anything else. And I too was watching the convention and noticing this really huge emphasis on trying to talk to people who don't share our view, and I just don't think I'm capable of that.
It's difficult if you grew up there and you have known the same people for me. I've known most of my friends for 65, 75 years. When I went to school, I met them and they're still there. And as many as I try to keep as friends. But many of them don't want to hear me talk. And it's as though there's a southern reluctance to face their own past and present. It's really tough. My close still the little girl who lived next door.
Hey, Ellen, I don't know if it's just me or not. If you could please move a little closer to the computer. I felt like you were cutting out here and there. I think I caught most of what you said.
I'm so far away, and I've knocked it off the table several times trying to get close. But I think it's close. Yeah.
You're cutting, like, you're missing words here and there. I think I caught
Yeah.
most.
I'm missing words here and there too.
It's because I'm in the mountains of Vermont. So
I mean, there are worse places to be. So, but
I will listen today and not try to talk.
Well,
I mean,
now
we can
getting
hear
closer.
enough to catch what you're saying. But I was just seeing if there was a way to we can catch all of it because we want to hear what you have to say.
Well, in the last 2 or 3 minutes or sentences, you've been closer. Apparently, you've leaned closer because it's been clearer than it was before.
That volume, does that help? The volume is the higher.
Rabbi Sacks, I think, he touches on what you're saying, Ellen, too, towards the end at the bottom of 260. Like, listening to another human being, let alone God, is an act of opening ourselves up to a mind radically other than our own. This takes courage. To listen is to make myself vulnerable. My deepest certainties may be shaken by entering the mind of one who thinks quite differently about the world. Like, if you don't want to hear what someone else has to say, then you're right. Like, then you don't have to listen. Like, if you don't want to, if you know in your heart you're right, then why are you going to listen to what somebody else has to say? What's the point if you already know the answer? But that's, I think, Rabbi Sacks's point is, well, you might not know the answer. And opening yourself up means you might have to admit you're wrong. It means the things that you thought were true might just not be. And how do we deal with that? And he makes the point, listening is essential to our humanity. It's the antidote to narcissism. It's the antidote to fundamentalism. But we need to make the effort. We need to put in the work to hear what others have to say, because that's how we go about humanity. That's what democracy is based on, is the idea that everybody has a voice that they are welcome to use. and you don't have to agree, and you vote. You vote for the people who agree with you and let the majority make that decision. But tuning people out is anti-democratic and, as Rabbi Sacks argues, anti-Jewish as well.
I find that I think I live in such a silo that I really do not encounter people whose views are very much different from my own. I can read things, but there's no way to have a dialogue when you're reading things. You know, I can listen to things on from various places, but again, there's no way to have a dialogue, and so it doesn't really enlighten me. So I've been thinking about that for a while, that I just don't know how to encounter people that I can
Well,
listen.
no worries, Margaret. I can introduce you to a few if you really want that exposure.
I'm sure
I was
you
gonna say,
probably
I-
just walk down the
Is
street.
that a
Yeah,
threat
I
or a
just came from
travesty?
I just came from the gym over here at Lakeshore, and one of the trainers asked her client, "So have you been watching the convention?" And I thought, oh my goodness, she's never been in business or politics. You know, ask a loaded question like that. And he gave her an answer too. So yeah, people don't mind talking, Margaret. I'm glad you're not exposed, but no worries.
I was gonna say, my gut says you probably know more people than you think you do. You may just not have, you may not have broached those subjects with them.
Right.
But I'll say two additional things. I'll say one, Rabbi Sacks kind of talks about that a little bit in here too, where he says, especially with social media, we pick and choose who we follow. We pick and choose the sources we want to hear from, and so it's very easy to get siloed in, because we naturally pick the sources that we want to hear from that agree with us. So unless we are consciously making efforts and choices to listen to those who have different opinions, you're not going to hear it. And we do the same thing socially. You know, we tend to hang out with the people that share our values, that share our opinions, and that we get along well with. And so we tend to socially not spend a lot of time with those with whom we disagree. So again, there's a little bit of a conscious act that we need to do to be able to find those people, but they're out there.
I'm sure they are.
So to Ellen's point, though, I think that what I mean, so I'm 79. What seems different to me, or most painful to me, is the polarization. The extremes seem to be far more extreme than I can remember from years ago. And that's the part that is truly scary. So I do still wear something every time I leave the house. Mug David, my little banner for the Nova people. And I know people here in Birmingham who say they are not comfortable doing that. They're fearful to identify as Jewish when they go through the neighborhood. But I feel like that's something I have to do. And yet I saw a very cute shirt supporting a candidate as I was leaving, and she told me where she got it. And I thought, gee, I'm not sure I could wear that shirt. I can wear,
What did it
I'm
say?
not, what did it say?
Yeah.
It said Kamala, and it had it spelled phonetically. And it said, but if you can't pronounce it, just say Madam President.
That's great.
Yeah, I thought it was cute.
It took me a long time to understand the T-shirt that was a comma and then the LA.
Oh,
And then I finally heard her explanation of how to pronounce her name, which was thank you. You might notice that Clinton mispronounced it. Bill Clinton.
oh, that's funny.
But
Oh, Rabbi,
yes.
a question. What do you think about this, the contrast that Sacks draws between the Greek use of sight and the Hebrew use of listening or hearing, or all of the things that Shema means?
I thought it was an interesting dichotomy. I think go back. I think it was mostly on page 259. See if he talked about it before that, but 259 is where he spends most of the time looking at it. It's an interesting contrast. Like the Greek culture was a very visual culture. The art, the philosophy of aesthetics, so much of what we do is kind of centered around Greek culture. And it's an interesting counterpoint that Judaism uses Shema, and like Shema is listening, paying attention, audio as a center of it. That listening dialogue is more of the center than the focus than a visual. That being said, I'm not sure one is necessarily better than the other. I think of educational philosophy, which says, there's students learn in lots of different ways. There are audio learners, there are visual learners, there are tactile learners, there are kinesthetic learners. I feel there's one more I'm forgetting, but so I think we do need a visual, because there are some people who are visual learners and that's how they're going to process it. Judaism trends towards the audio, that's fine, but it still does have a visual component in that you're reading the text, you're not just listening to
them. That being, all those things being said, I mean, do you think that there's a fundamental, he seems to be implying that there's a fundamental philosophical difference between the two cultures?
I mean, there is a philosophical difference between the two cultures. I'm not sure it's necessarily in the seeing and hearing, though that might be part of it.
I mean, right, obviously there is, but I don't think necessarily that that's as central as he is making it to be.
I think there are lots of things that separate Greek Western culture from from a Jewish culture. This might be one of them, yes, where I don't think, Judaism definitely has an art scene, but it's not as prominent, as boldly prominent as it was in ancient Greece. Right? I'm making a broad statement.
More modern than it's much more modern than ancient Greece. And
I think it's more, modernly we have a more developed Jewish art scene as we've been influenced by the cultures that we've lived among for centuries. But nonetheless, there is archaeological evidence of ancient synagogues where that had some significant art in it. So it's not like Judaism is entirely anti-visual or anti-art.
It's certainly decorative art, if not representational art, is really prominent in the old synagogues that I've seen. Maybe there are many others that have more representational art that I don't know about.
Representational art is generally somewhat discouraged in Judaism based on the Ten Commandments. You shall not make graven images or any. So, I mean, you see somewhat less of that than you would say in churches. But it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means it's less, it's not as common. I think Rabbi Sacks is trying to make a broad point about the value that Judaism puts on listening, and he's using that as a contrast. So, trying to shift the dialogue from when somebody says something, instead of saying, "Ah, I see," say, "I hear you," right? Often somebody's explaining like, "Ah, I see what you're saying." Yes, because that is a visual component that he's arguing is left over from the Greek. I think what he's arguing is, "Ah, I hear you. I hear what you're saying. I understand." Like that's a different concept. I'm not sure. Feels a little semantic to me, but it fits the larger point that he's trying to make about the value of listening.
And it goes, I keep harping on this because I think it's so interesting. It goes along because mentioned this last week about all about God speaking the word in the world into existence. So it's kind of all of that is of a piece.
Rabbi Sacks makes an interesting point on that line as well, that again, I think this might be a little bit residual. Ironically, I think this might be somewhat residual from Greek philosophy. But when God creates, God necessarily creates something other than God's self. Kabbalah might not necessarily agree with that statement, but that's kind of the thrust of what Rabbi Sacks says on 260, is when God creates humans, God creates something other than God's self. And so, again, there's a choice here in that we can share God's mind, in which case we have no free will, or we don't share God's mind and we do have free will, but that means that we need to listen to what God is trying to tell us when God is trying to tell us things. And that we need to consciously open our own minds to hear what God is trying to say.
So Rabbi, when you say what God is trying to tell us, you're presenting God as being instructive. In other words, I struggle with this distinguishment between free will and God's instruction. Because if God is telling us what to do, then are we saying free will is the will to listen or not to listen, to heed or not to heed? What is free will? That's what you're saying God is. How God fits into our relationship.
Instead of saying God is instructive, I would say God is relational. Is that God talks, you can use talk metaphorically, but God, is in conversation with us. We just have to choose whether or not we're going to listen to what God has to say. Just like I said at the beginning, like my wife says I never listen to her or something like that, right? Like that's a choice. That's a conscious choice. I'm not really going to, yes, I know she's talking. I'm not really going to pay attention.
So then if we choose to listen or not to listen, do you believe, does Judaism teach that God knows how we're going to respond? Because if he knows how we're going to respond, then is it really free will?
So this is one of Rabbi Artzin's sticking points in process theology. Rabbi Artzin makes this exact argument and says, if you have an omniscient God, if God knows everything, then God knows what our choices are going to be. And is it really free will if God already knows what the choice is going to be, because God knows everything? And he makes the argument that, you can't really have free will with an omniscient God because of that. Which is why he makes the argument that we do have free will, but God does not know the choice that we're going to make next. Because necessarily, if we have free will, God doesn't know that.
Well, how about, why can't God know it and just know it without, doing anything about it?
Well, then how can we change? In other words, right, on Yom Kippur, we're supposed to go back to our real selves. Well, how can we do that if God already knows what we're going to do? It isn't really within our power to do the work.
I don't see that at all. It seems to me that even if God knows if there is a God who knows what you're going to do, and he, she, it just takes a step back and observes, that I don't see how that interferes with free will.
We learn by our mistakes. So we're going to do that thing, and then we're going to learn by it, hopefully.
Well, there's a difference between knowing what's going to happen and directing what's going to happen. So to me, there's just two ways of thinking about it. One is, God has this plan for everybody, and every incident in your life is already predetermined. And that does kind of take that free will thing away. Or you believe that you have free will and you are directing your life and how you interact with everything, how you deal with your crises and everything, which is kind of how I believe. It's just, again, very hard for me to think that, well, I guess it goes back to what you say, what is being the chosen people means. It's God's certainly not, having a big hand in protecting us. In fact, he seems to let us, have some pretty horrific things happen to us as a people, not just the normal tragedy in life, where your son dies or, your mother gets run over by a car. The end.
So I'm trying to think. So if God knows what's going to happen, how exactly do we have free will? Because the choice is what we're going to do is in some sense already been determined.
I think that's a leap, an intellectual leap.
So explain your position.
Well,
because I'm not understanding it clearly.
I am positing, I wouldn't say it's my position, but I am positing that there is a God who is omniscient and therefore knows everything, but does not intervene to make things happen. Is kind of like a dispassionate observer, shall you say, of what's going on. Let's see what these, I created these funny little things, let me see what they do.
Okay, so let's create kind of a scenario that sitting in front of you is an apple and a piece of chocolate cake. And you know you're going to have one of them, but not the other. If God knows you're going to pick the chocolate cake.
He's wrong, but anyhow.
All right. Let's say let's just, for the sake of this situation, God knows you're going to pick the chocolate cake.
Right.
When you pick the chocolate cake, did you actually make a choice?
Why not?
Because
just because God knows it doesn't prevent me from, I can't see how the fact that God knows what I'm going to do, which choice I'm going to make. I don't see how that, he doesn't, knowing and determining seem to me to be two different concepts. God knows what I'm going to do, but God does not in principle determine. I mean, there's
Okay, but that was maybe a struggle for a few of us on this screen, but we're talking real struggles. You know, God forbid someone has a family member sick in the hospital. They see a wad of $100 bills lying on the ground, and the person in front of them had just pulled out. So what do? Does God know what you're going to do, or do you have a choice as to whether or not you're going to put those bills in your pocket, or are you going to tap that guy on the shoulder and say, hey, I think this fell out when you went for your wallet?
so I think this is where I hear what you're saying, Margaret. Like, I understand your point. I think where I'm struggling is, if God knows what's going to happen before we do, if God knows what the sequence of events that our choices will happen, and God knows that before we make that choice, then I guess I don't understand the difference between predetermination and knowing. Right? Like, if God knows what's going to happen in the future, then in some sense we don't have a choice, because that's the choice that's going to have to happen. Because otherwise, God is right.
I just can't see that, just because. I guess I can. I mean, maybe this is just going down a rabbit hole that we're never going to get out of, but they just seem like two different things, and I don't know how to explain.
I think I hear where you're struggling. I'm just struggling to, like, I understand what you're trying to say. I think I'm just struggling on how it actually plays out. Because if God knows I'm going to pick the chocolate cake and I pick the apple, that means God is wrong.
No, I don't think God is going to, that if God knows that I'm going to pick the chocolate cake, and I pick the chocolate cake, it isn't because God somehow made me do it. It's because I happen to like chocolate cake, and God knows me really well, and so He knows what choice I'm going to make.
So, okay, so that's a relational question of, I know you well enough to know what you're going to choose. Is that what you're saying? But at the same time, once in a while, I know my wife pretty well. We've been together for almost 22 years. Sorry to realize it's almost 22 years. It's coming up soon. Yes, but we've been together 22 years. We know each other pretty well. But once in a while, one of us will do something that the other doesn't expect. And we're like caught off guard. We're like, huh, that really surprised me that you said that. Or it really surprised me that you did that. So in relationship, there has to be a space for that to happen. there has to be that space that, yes, you know this person really well. You know what you have a pretty good guess as to what they're going to do. But if you're always right, then there's something, that's where I think I'm struggling. That if they're always right, then there's not actually a free will part to it, because
they're always right. They just happen to, using your example.
I'm sorry, but what is the Jewish philosophy about God controlling everything or knowing everything? It's almost the same, right?
The answer is yes.
Is yes what?
Yes.
Complete sentence, please.
As I've shared before, the story of one of my classmates asking our associate dean, what does Judaism say about blah? And they say, what does Judaism say about free will? Well, it depends which rabbi you read. There are midrashim in which, when God created the world and God created Adam, that God could see, and Adam actually saw also, everything that was going to happen from that moment to the end of time. And that God knew everything that was going to happen up until, like, through the Messianic age, which means we don't really have a choice. That's already been determined what's going to happen. God knew at the moment of creation every single thing that would happen from that moment on.
Could I go back to, I'm sorry, I don't mean
to. Wait. So what, there's other?
So that's one view, which is out there in Jewish texts. There's other views that God is omniscient, but we have free will, which is essentially Margid's argument, right? That God knows what we're going to choose, but, we still have the choice to make. And then there's Rabbi Artzin's argument, which is God doesn't know what we're going to choose, and we have free will. Or you could say, because we have free will, God doesn't know what we're going to choose. All of which exist in the context of Jewish literature.
Let's go back to you and your wife for a moment.
So you can decide actually which way you want to be, and it be completely within your Jewishness.
That's the beauty of Judaism.
Okay.
So going back to you and your wife again. Suppose you know your wife very, very well, and she knows you very, very well. And in every case that happens in your whole life together, you are right about what your wife is going to do, and your wife is right about what you are going to do. It does not fall from that you have caused your wife to be right, you have caused your wife's actions, nor has she caused your actions. So that would be my final word.
So my response is twofold. I think one, practically that doesn't happen. We surprise each other. But more to the point, I don't claim omniscience. I don't claim I know what's going to happen. I have an educated guess as to what's going to happen based on 22 years of experience in relationship, but I don't claim to know.
You're just
and sometimes she'll do what I think she's going to do, and my response is, I knew you were going to say that. But again, that's not omniscience. That's 22 years of relationship.
So you're picking on my bad example, but as I did not on yours, but even if you did claim omniscience, it still wouldn't make, it still wouldn't, suppose you say, I'm you claim, okay, I'm omniscient. I know what Orly's going to do, every moment of every day and every choice she's going to make. That still doesn't seem to me to mean that that Orly does not have free will. Basta. I have said all I'm going to say about this. I'm sorry. I apologize for.
It sounds like we will agree to disagree, but
Okay,
go ahead, Diane.
So I just want to add one more thought for right now, maybe more later. But Morgan, there are people who have certain weaknesses. Chocolate cake could be at the top of the list. But for those people who struggle to make very hard life choices, it seems to me that in saying things are predetermined, they could use that as a crutch and say, well, I always choose chocolate cake. And that's just my personality. And I mean, I'm sure you've run across a few of those over the course of your life. That's my preference. I've always chosen it. And I think that's just the way I'm made. I'm always going to go for the chocolate cake. And there's nothing that I can really do about it. That's where I have a problem with it, because I think that I do have sometimes hard, but control over the decisions that I make and the choices, the things that I do from when I wake up until when I go to sleep.
I
And if
don't,
I thought it was
I don't disagree with you one single bit.
okay,
It's just what I'm talking about isn't what, I mean, I'm 100% in agreement with you. It's just my argument has to do with what God is up to, not what you are up to in making your.
right. But for people of faith who think that God has already decided, that could be detrimental in their choices that they make.
I
In
don't,
my opinion.
yeah.
You know, you saw what I put in the chat. I think for maybe the first 10 years, I tried to talk to Howard about this, and I just let it go.
Look, some of it might be a preference of theology. You know,
Right.
I like the idea and the concept that I am in relationship with God, but I can still surprise God by my actions. That I can do something that God doesn't expect, because in some sense that makes me feel closer to God, to know that God knows me well, but I can still surprise God just in this, similarly to how I can still surprise Orly. But some people want the comfort of knowing that God knows everything and God knows what we're going to do and God knows what's going to happen, and that this is a part of God's plan. I just don't like that. That theology doesn't speak to me as well. Maybe someday we'll get to Rabbi Artson's book and we can see how he explains it. He might explain it better than I do. But
it doesn't speak to me either. I'm just arguing in principle that the two are not, the two things are not mutually exclusive.
But this also feels like a good place to have the conversation of, you know, the dialogue we've been having for the last few minutes. Is, you know, we took the time to kind of hear each other's arguments, to try to understand what the other person's argument was. Others tried to explain why we disagree and have a respectful dialogue about where we're both coming from and hearing each other out to be able to do that. That's what Rabbi Sacks is trying to argue for in this chapter, right? Is that you might disagree. You might come to a point where you hear something and say, you know, I don't necessarily agree with that. So, and that might make me question. Now, were Margaret or I able to, you know, did we raise points that might cause the other to question? I don't know. But, you know, we had responses, but we thought about it and we thought about our responses to see what is, that's okay. That's how this is supposed to work, is that we listen to each other, we try to understand each other, we ask questions of each other, even if it's not what we want to hear. And even if we end up in a, you know what, we agreed to disagree, we agreed to different philosophical points, and that's okay. That's okay. But we took the time to actually hear the other person's arguments before going on to in the conversation. And that's, I think, the message that Rabbi Sacks is trying to make us pay attention to. Shema mina, to use a term, to learn from, of how we can do that, how we can implement that in our lives, even when it's difficult, even when we don't agree, even when we might not want to hear what the other person has to say. Can we still be patient enough to hear and listen and process and be open to the discussion that and the points that the other person is making? Any concluding thoughts, comments, questions?
Rabbi, I would
Yeah.
like to suggest that this is particularly difficult in the South. If you are late and suddenly a little group, ladies who have lunch and have been doing it for 4 years, invite you to them. They tell you, clients, we will not discuss religion, nor will we discuss anything political. That pretty much takes away the possibility of actually having what I call a conversation or a listening period with someone else.
Yes. And you can have those conversations outside of the lunch. So you can try to find another time or situation if you wanted to have those conversations with somebody and say, I know you don't want to talk religion or politics over lunch, but I'd really love to get your feelings on this. Can we find another way to have that conversation?
Only once.
I care about you and I want to hear what you have to say.
Once in years that has happened, that I've said, I don't know anything about any of you will do in the voting booth. I just wonder if there's anyone who would join me voting for Obama. And there was like dead silence. They hardly breathing that I'd had the nerve to ask. And finally, the one that I'm to raised her little hand and said, I will tell you, of course I'm voting for Obama. But if you tell my husband, I will be forever off your lips. And then one by one, this table of 10 women, all mountain born, raised, schooled, etc. Not all of them, but I'd say 80% said, of course I'm going to vote for Obama. But the unwritten conversation would have continued with what we in the South hold as sacred truth, which of course is not.
Something in the South of not wanting to rock the social boat.
That's right. They don't want their little status and their friend circles and their country clubs and their churches to know that they're not with them.
Yes.
But there are people who vote right. I've learned that one. When they,
yes, and I think that's one of those things that I think might just take a little more concerted effort on our parts, living in that environment of people who might not want to rock the social boat. Maybe you don't have a group conversation, though, I am proud of you for being able to have it with a group of women. That was uncomfortable, that I'm sure everybody was uncomfortable having, but
they sure were.
May I ask, Ellen, if they were all Jewish women or if it was a mix?
This particular one was not even a mix. It was a straight mountain brook, which means Jews are left out of most things in the social world.
Mhm.
So,
Interesting.
you
Look,
know,
I'm
perhaps even all the more so that this conversation is important to have in Birmingham and in the South, where people don't want to talk about it. So it makes listening all the more important when you do have the opportunities to do so.
right.
If I were to run across if I knew somebody that had, I would want to say, look, I really respect you. And I think you're bright and I respect you. And I know that your ideas are different from mine. And I'm just curious to hear you tell me about them and what they are and why you believe them.
It's hard to do that. Very.
I'll tell you this, anytime someone has said that to me, they're usually trying to convert me to Christianity. I get very nervous when people say how much they respect me and how much they like me, and they just want to talk to me for a few minutes. So I don't want to.
I would say when they talk to you, but I'm talking about saying I want to listen to you. So.
Yeah, that's a way you could turn that around. And if somebody said that to you, you could say, I'm happy to listen to you. Doesn't mean you're going to expound on what you believe or whatever.
I tell you what, I've known some for 78 years. My little next door neighbor. I love her. She loves me. I'm not willing to give her up because we are so different in this particular realm. She's been doing good work than I have, and with Black people, but she's not educated. Well, she's just not aware of how things work. If you want certain things in Congress, you've got to
Compromise.
above all other things. You've got to listen. Number 2, number 3. You could go down a list of things that will make it possible. But most possible.
So compromise requires some active listening as well to understand what it is the other person truly wants and how much you're willing to give up in that compromise for what's truly most important to them. That's also a listening process. Kol hakavod, everyone. Thank you for a good conversation today, as always. Good to learn with y'all, and wishing everybody a good week. If I don't see you before then, Shabbat Shalom, and looking forward to learning together next week.
Shabbat Shalom.
But
Shabbat shalom.
thank you.
Well, everyone.